Hello everyone. Salam, Namaste, Adab, and welcome to today's event. Today we are going to listen to very illustrious professors from Harvard. Professor Sugata Bose is going to talk on Rabindranath Tagore's Poetry and Politics from 1924 to 1941, a view from 2024. That's the title. He will be formally introduced by Dr. Ankit Dey, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of California, San Diego. He is trained as a modern South Asian historian at Tufts and Harvard. And later on, at the end of the talk, we will hear the comments and some other remarks by Nobel laureate Professor Amartya Sen, who is the Thomas Lamont University professor and professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard. So welcome you all. And now I invite Dr. Ankit Dey for a formal introduction of the speaker. Dr. Ankit.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation, and welcome to all of you. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. It is a pleasure to introduce Professor Sugata Bose, today's main speaker. Professor Bose, as many of you know, is a historian both of the political economy of India, Bengal in particular, and more importantly, of the Indian Ocean world. He's the author of several books. I'm not going to mention all of them. I would say one being in 2006, a book called The Hundred Horizons, which saw the Indian Ocean as we know it as an interconnected economic and cultural sphere. And that was a very influential book in the field. And later, very recently this year, he has come up with another major book called Asia After Europe, Imagining a Continent in the Long 20th Century, which looks not just at the Indian Ocean, but at Asiatic connections more broadly, intellectual connections between India, China, and Japan, and then beyond, especially in how anti-colonial connections were formed by intellectuals in these erstwhile colonial empires. The book, most importantly, is not just historical, but makes an urgent contemporary message in an Asia that is fractured still by nation states. A promise holds out to have a continental imagining beyond national and sectarian borders in some sense. I mentioned these two works. He has written well over 5 or 6 major works. I mentioned these two because his subject today, Rabindranath Tagore, plays a key role in both, and we will hear a little bit of it. I should add here that Professor Bose has also been involved with translations and musical performances of Tagore over many, many years, including a volume called Tagore, The World Voyager, about Tagore's poetry, addressing the world at large, and also another volume, which I hope he talks about today, a translation by Charuchandra Chaudhuri, I think, called Purobi, the East in the Feminine Gender. It is very exciting to listen to him. By way of introducing the talk, I just wanted to share something very quickly with all of you, which is to say, a few days ago, I was walking past a small bookstore here in La Jolla, California, just by the ocean, and I came across this picture pasted. The bookstore has very little to do with India or South Asia, but this image was there, quite an old print. I was somewhat intrigued because we are told that Tagore is forgotten now across the world. His Western presence was high once, and it's no longer the case, which is largely true. So I started speaking to the owner, saying, "What?" It turns out he's quite an old man. He's in his 80s now. His father actually had met Tagore during one of the visits to California. I don't think the 1924 visit, but the one before. And a memory of sorts has been preserved. This was unexpected, not least because this was in the Pacific realm and Pacific connections across. I think we will today hear a great deal of Tagore's journey a century ago. And I just wanted to bring this in to say that I guess, some memories of Tagore as a world voyager, as a global figure, still persists in corners we sometimes do not notice. So Professor Bose, maybe you can take it on from here and begin the talk.
Thank you very much, Aniket, for that introduction. And I will now try to share my screen. Let me just Can you see my screen now?
Sorry, are you having some difficulty?
Can you see my screen?
Oh. No, we are seeing yourself on a camera.
Let me. Am I still the co-host is the question.
Yes, you are.
Share and see.
Share.
Okay, now it is coming up. Yes, we can see it now.
It's now coming up?
Yes, it's there. Thank you.
All right. I think we are ready to go. Thanks once more to Aniket for the introduction and to Dr. Aziuddin for inviting me to speak on Tagore. 1924 was a year of some importance for a series of Asian crossings and conversations. I go to China in what capacity, I do not know. Rabindranath Tagore wrote to Romarola on February 24, 1924. Is it as a poet or as a bearer of good advice and sound common sense? Tagore's hesitation regarding which of his multiple identities to privilege would have some bearing on his reception in China. He had been invited to deliver a series of addresses by the Peking Lecture Association, which in the recent past had hosted John Dewey, Bertrand Russell, and Hans Driesch. Tagore carefully selected his travel companions, Amartya Sen, a scholar of comparative religion, and the artist Nandalal Bose joined him from Vishwabharati. And from Calcutta University came Kalidas Nag. Nearly 8 years after his first easterly voyage, Tagore boarded the Ethiopia in Calcutta on March 21, 1924, having expressed the hope that their visit would re-establish the cultural and spiritual connection between China and India. Oops. Sorry. The Ethiopia followed much the same route in 1924 that the Tosamaru had in 1916. The poet was hosted by the business magnate Abdul Karim Jamal in Rangoon. A large crowd gathered in Penang to carry Tagore in a procession accompanied by music to the home of P.K. Nambiar, a local lawyer. Sitting on his bed in a corner of his cabin, Tagore had by then composed 2 of the 6 lectures he was slated to give in China. A brief stop at Port Swettenham enabled him to take a tour of Kuala Lumpur. 8 years earlier, Tagore had been impressed by the work ethic of Chinese laborers in Hong Kong Harbour and forecast the future rise of China. On this occasion, during his halt for 3 days at the home of a Surati merchant named Namazi, an emissary from Canton arrived bearing a graciously phrased letter of invitation from Sun Yat-sen, dated April 7th, 1924. Dear Mr. Tagore, the founder of the Chinese Republic wrote, I should greatly wish to have the privilege of personally welcoming you on your arrival in China. It is an ancient way to show honor to the scholar. But in you I shall greet not only a writer who has added luster to Indian letters, but a rare worker in those fields of endeavor wherein lie the seeds of man's future welfare and spiritual triumphs. Whether poorly advised or exercising poor judgment of his own, Tagore declined the invitation, citing time constraints. Had he accepted Sun Yat-sen's invitation, he would have found how Canton in 1924 had become the confluence of a diverse band of Asians seeking freedom. In Hong Kong, the Singaporean Chinese scholar Lim Boon Keng, Vice-Chancellor of the newly established Amoy University, came to see Tagore, laying the foundation for future interactions between the Chinese and Indian literati. Shanghai, not Canton, turned out to be Tagore's gateway to China on April 12, 1924. The young poet Xu Jimu was on hand to receive him, along with a large crowd of admirers. Tagore did not like what he saw of the use of Indian soldiers by the British against the Chinese in Shanghai, and wrote an article condemning that practice in Probashi. He reached Peking on April 23, 1924. There was an outburst of enthusiasm in the Qianmen station on the day he arrived, such as has never been accorded to any other foreign guest. The following day, Liang Qiqiao welcomed Tagore at a grand reception.
Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. Professor Bose, please unmute. Just unmute yourself. You can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please. I just unmuted everyone. There was some kind of.
There was some, yes. The following day, Liang Qiqiao welcomed Tagore at a grand reception. Not everyone was as warm and effusive as Liang in embracing Tagore. Amartya Sen suggests that Tagore himself may have been partly responsible for eliciting a critical response by a mistaken choice of what aspect of his persona to present in China. A message that had struck a chord among a sensitive section of the European literati, disenchanted with the crass materialist excesses and brutal nationalist conflicts of the 1910s, did not appeal to a rising generation of Chinese intellectuals, challenging encumbrances from the past and keen on embracing a materialist modernity in the early 1920s. Tagore gave anywhere between 30 and 40 informal talks and some half a dozen formal lectures during his month and a half in China. In introducing himself to his Chinese audience, he spoke of three movements that had cast a formative influence on his life. The first was a revolutionary religious movement introduced by a very great-hearted man of gigantic intelligence, Raja Ram Mohan Roy. The second was the literary revolution pioneered by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who, quote, lifted the dead weight of ponderous forms from our language, unquote. The third was a national movement that proclaimed it was a mistake to be indiscriminate in our rejection of the past. This was not a reactionary movement, but a revolutionary one, Tagore asserted, because it set out with a great courage to deny and to oppose all pride in mere borrowings. Turning to Kritimohan Sen, he said how he got acquainted with the mystic poets of the 13th to the 17th century through Sen's study, and was amazed to discover how modern they were. His friend Nandalal Bose would be able to confirm how the art movement begun by Rabindranath was growing in vitality. As for music, he could speak for himself. My songs have found their place in the heart of my land, along with her flowers that are never exhausted, and that the folk of the future, in days of sorrow or joy or festival, will have to sing them. This too is the work of a revolutionary. Having presented his modernist and revolutionary credentials, Tagore described his religion as a poet's religion, whose touch came to him through the same unseen and trackless channels as the inspiration of his music. In China, Rabindranath articulated the principles he believed ought to undergird Asian unity. In Asia, we must seek our strength in union, he suggested, in an unwavering faith in righteousness, and never in the egotistic spirit of separateness and self-assertion. In Asia, we must unite, not through some mechanical method or organization, but through a spirit of true sympathy. He was quite open to accepting truth when it came from the West. The West came, in Tagore's telling, not to give of its best, or to seek our best, but to exploit us for the sake of material gain. It even came into our homes, robbing us of our own. That is how Europe overcame Asia. The responsibility of Asians, therefore, was to rise from their stupor and prove that they were not beggars. Copying and imitating the West would not do. We want to find our own birthright, Tagore proclaimed. To students who wanted progress, the poet suggested that there need not remain forever a gulf between progress and perfection. If you can bridge this gulf with the gift of beauty, he urged, you will do a great service to humanity. The criticisms he received rankled sufficiently for Tagore to cut short his stay in Peking. On May 18, 1924, Tagore took his leave at a final meeting in a university setting. He saw it as a gathering of intimate friends, and he had never been so happy nor so closely in touch with any other people. He could see that some had been afraid that the poet was importing the spiritual contagion from India that might weaken their vigorous faith in money and materialism. He assured them that he had not convinced a single skeptic that he has a soul or that moral beauty has greater value than material power. The modernist intellectual who had some experience in building solidarity among Asian expatriates in the United States on the eve of World War I, applied some balm on behalf of the hosts, saying that Tagore and his party had succeeded nobly and admirably in their task, and that he had become a warm admirer of the poet and his friends. Despite the controversies generated by Tagore's visit in the realm of politics, Gal Givili has persuasively argued that the brief sojourn, along with the Tagorean influence more generally, served as a vehicle for the Chinese envisioning of Pan-Asian poetics. The understanding of trans-regional connections as emotionally stimulated was reflected in Xu Zhimu's poetry and Wang Tongshao's literary criticism that absorbed Tagore's sensitive evocation of religious sensibility. In Xu Zhimu's poem, Sunrise over Mount Tai, the debt to Tagore is obvious. Givili finds the ideal of Pan-Asian poetics in its most realized form in the work of Bing Xin, who grasped intuitively Tagore's conception of the harmony between the individual soul and the universe, and gave expression to it in an interpersonal poetic form, for instance, in her 1925 poem, Yarning. Yet, to interpret Tagore as a poet of Asian spirituality against Western materialism, as Givili does, is to take a blinkered view of his literary genius. Unfortunately, Tagore did not get the Nobel Prize for his greatest poetry, and Chinese poets, translators, and critics in the 1910s and 1920s were limited to English versions of his Bengali poems, mostly from Gitanjali. Tagore was perfectly aware of this limitation and said to his Chinese audience, "I'm gratified to hear from you that you are convinced that I'm a poet because I have a beautiful grey beard. But my vanity will remain unsatisfied until you know me from my voice that is in my poems. I hope that this may make you want to learn Bengali someday. I hope yonder rival poet taking notes opposite me will consider this seriously. I will admit him into my class and help him so far as I am able." Tagore's finest modern poetry, celebrating life, love, women, and the wonders of this world, was to be composed later in 1924 and in early 1925 to appear in his book Purobi, which he rendered as the East in its feminine gender. Tagore arrived in Shanghai on May 28th and bid farewell to China the next day. On May 26, 1924, the United States Congress had enacted the Johnson-Reed Act, widely referred to as the Orientals Exclusion Act, imposing stringent immigration restrictions on Asians. 1924 was an election year in the United States, and President Calvin Coolidge promptly signed the exclusionary law. After Tagore's departure, his friends in Shanghai established an Asiatic Association later that year. There is on foot an important movement to establish Asiatic concord through the common culture of Asiatic nations, the Christian Science Monitor of Boston reported from Shanghai. Inspiration for the movement is acknowledged to Tagore, whose teachings permeate the issued declaration. After crossing the sea from Shanghai to Kobe, Tagore settled in at the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo for a month-long stay. Japan was reeling from the after effects of devastating earthquakes in September 1923 and January 1924. Tagore's Japanese hosts were angry about the exclusionary law in the United States, contravening the so-called Gentleman's Agreement of 1917. Tagore met Rashbihari Bose and his family, who made sure that the poet felt comfortable in Japan. Tagore's message of the intrinsic relationship between beauty and hospitality had a friendlier reception in Japan than in China. In Japan, the universalist turn in the domain of art was alive and well. Nandalal Bose had the privilege of being hosted by Tagore's friend Yokoyama Taikan and was introduced to masterpieces of Japanese art. Tagore urged his hosts to exorcise the demon called nation in the interest of peace. Sun Yat-sen would deliver much the same message on his trip to Japan 6 months later. In my new book, Asia After Europe, I have a discussion of Tagore's and Sun Yat-sen's visits to Japan and their speeches there in 1924. While in Japan, in May 1924, Rabindranath received an invitation to visit South America on the occasion of the centenary of Peru's independence. The traveler in him could not resist the temptation to visit a new people in a new land. Tagore was well known among the Spanish-reading public through the translations of Juan Ramón Jiménez and Zenobia Camprubi, but had so far had no direct experience of the Latin world outside France. On 19 September 1924, he set off from Calcutta in broken health on his trip around half the globe. But the boons he received from the goddess of poetry in his tired frame, writes Prabhat Kumar Mukhopadhyay with no exaggeration, will remain immortal in the history of literature. These were Purobi in poetry and Poshchim Jatri Diary, Diary of a Westward Voyage in prose. A profound sense of yearning and loss, even a wrenching pain in solitude, seems to have been the main impulse behind Rabindranath's creativity as a poet. It was this emotion, somewhere in the depths of his being, which must have enabled him to compose 2 of his greatest poems on board the ship Haranamaru in the Indian Ocean on 1st October 1924. In Fulfillment, Purnata, he conveys his essence of the conversation between woman and man on which destiny had conspired to eavesdrop. The translations I will be reading are by my maternal grandfather, Charuchandra Chaudhuri, which my mother, Krishna Bose, and I put together a number of years ago with a long literary and historical introduction. That whispered communion of ours, the stars of the Pleiades heard. In the bushes of the evening rose, off and on in wafts it flowed, then in stealth came between us, in mask of death, a boundless breach. Our meetings ended, no more speech availed in that touchless infinity. Yet the void is not an empty void. An anguished fiery vapor fills the sky, and all alone, in songs glowing in the fire, I create a world of dreams. Rabindranath's ceaseless search for the woman of the mind had long been a recurring feature of his poetry. That search reached the zenith of poetic utterance in The Call, Ahvan. It began, all through this life and times without number, have I wandered crying for the woman who would call me to her. The Call is a long poem in which each stanza vies with another to excel in rhythm and imagery. If there is one that has an edge among the connoisseurs of Bengali literature, it is this one. Mohendrer bajra hote kalo chokkhe bidduter alo ano ano daki. From the thunderbolt of Indra, bring forth in your dark eyes the flash of lightning. Thou summer storm, light up the fire in the cloud, within me, eager to shed its rain. The still, the dumb, the imprisoned bounty within its tear-laden bosom darkens. Set it free in a wild torrent. Empty it, rob it of all, and save it. There is little doubt that Rabindranath's woman was the creative imagination of a male mind. Yet it is often supposed that the mind of Rabindranath had an androgynous character. This is to confuse the keenness of observation and empathy with which he generally nurtured the female characters in his fiction and poetry with the nature of his thinking. In his ruminations on man and woman, Rabindranath was not above broaching his own essentialized views on the difference of gender. He engaged in polemical disagreements with the worshippers of solid realism for their discomfort with the disturbing ghost of this unreal woman. The way in which he then connected the power of illusion with poetic creativity is best given in his own words. A man who is totally devoid of illusion may laugh at this, but then a man without illusion never knows the calamity of the creative urge. He lives in the midst of calamity. Less than a week after he wrote these lines, Rabindranath implored the ocean sky to lift its still and blue curtain so that he could discover the image of his momentary friend. Kholo kholo he akash, stabdho tabo neel jabonika. Mingled in shadow and light, she was beyond infinity in some illusory land, and the illusion of the unknown yearned for the fleeting vision. Lift, O sky, your still and blue curtain. I will look among the stars for the jewel from the garland of the fleeting moment. I will seek from where, in autumn, comes from an instant the twilight gleam, from where, along with rain, descends upon the earth the evening jasmine, and from where the storm receives its diadem of lightning with a sudden flare. On 11th October 1924, the Haranamaru arrived in Marseille. After spending a week in France, the poet set off for Latin America from Cherbourg on 18th October 1924. The Andes did not offer the same warmth of hospitality as the Japanese vessel Haranamaru, but Rabindranath discovered that it was possible to let the poetic imagination fly even inside a cramped cabin. The 3-week voyage across the Atlantic afforded time for 23 poems. The first, Stranger or Porichita, struck a rather plaintive note on the sorrow of the poet's solitude. Hope, Asha, was not exactly robust in its optimism, but revealed his heart's keen hunger. Only to utter her name with all the heart's longing, to go by her side just to hold her hand in mine, to sit alone when far away and only of her to think, and if near, her eyes full of eloquent gleam. Only to these and nothing more I would cling, and life's few days of sorrows and smiles at leisure I would live. No riches, no honor, but a little love did I seek. Dhan noy man noy. Grateful returns to the theme of remembrance of loves past. I will not forget, I said, when mute and with your eyes wet you looked up to my face. Forgive me if I have now forgotten. That was long, long ago. Today you are no more. You have gone from far to far. Sad is the evening in vermilion wiped from your brow. My life without a mate in an empty room is cheerless. all this is true, but above all, it is true, once you had been. As the Andes neared the shore, Rabindranath allowed himself one flight of ego into the future, sobered by a quick reflection on the past. By the time he arrived in Buenos Aires, the ache of a time gone by had deepened the ache of the moment. A variety of circumstances, not least the poet's frail health, led to the cancellation of plans to visit Peru. For nearly 2 months, from 7th November 1924 to 3rd January 1925, Rabindranath stayed in Argentina and wrote another 26 poems. From 12th November, he was the guest of Victoria Ocampo at her riverside garden house, Miralrio, in San Isidro. Until 11th November, the poet was still immersed in the past. Suddenly, on 12th November, upon his arrival at Miralrio, his poetry switched to the present tense. His poem, Alien Flower, Bideshi Phul, reveals a new sense of joy in Rabindranath's life. O alien flower, when I ask you, tell me, will you forget me ever? You smile and nod, but this I know, in your thoughts every now and again me you would recall. And when in a short while I would be gone to a distant land, the love of the far in your dream to you will make me known, and you will not forget. While Victoria, Vijaya, retrospectively came to be seen as the alien flower in the last spring of Rabindranath's life, the first poem directly addressed to her was The Guest, Otithi, written on 15th November 1924. With what infinite sweetness you fill the days of my sojourn, woman. Blessed one, you gaze upon my face even as those stars and say in the same strain, you are no stranger, I know you fully well. And though I do not know the language you speak, I hear you sing. The poet is a guest of love and a guest of mine forever. Unquestionably, I should mention that Charuchandra Chaudhary translated the Bengali word nari in the second line simply as woman, but chose to render Kollani as blessed one. Lady for Kollani, used in William Radice's version, does not seem to capture the nuances of the term Kollani. Unquestionably, Tagore's most beautiful poem from the San Isidro phase is Last Spring, Shesh Boshanto. The Key is another quintessential poem from Rabindranath's Last Spring. When Providence created his heart as a mansion of many rooms, he had thrown away the key to the silent, solitary, inmost chamber. I ponder if ever I would meet the traveler who has picked up the key on some unknown seashore, and she would open the door which nobody could discover. Whether Vijaya opened the door to the silent, solitary, inmost chamber, we cannot be absolutely sure, but she had almost certainly turned the key in the lock and threatened to barge in. In any event, on the day of Rabindranath's departure from Buenos Aires on board the Giulio Cesare, 3rd January 1925, his cabin door had to be taken apart from its hinges so that Vijaya could give him his favorite armchair as a token of her love. He wrote to her on 5th January, I pass most part of my day and a great part of my night deeply buried in your armchair, which at last has explained to me the lyrical meaning of the poem of Baudelaire that I read with you. She replied from San Isidro on 15th January, So at last you understood Baudelaire through my armchair. I hope that you may understand through that same piece of furniture what the lyrical meaning of my devotion is. I hope at least part of its meaning shall be revealed to you, the part a comfortable seat can reveal. Hélas, it is only a small part. The Baudelaire poem in question was L'Invitation au Voyage. Tagore had refused initially to grasp the relevance of furniture imagery to an erotic theme and referred to Baudelaire as your furniture poet. Rabindranath was probably feeling a little too comfortable in Vijaya's armchair. He wrote only 4 poems during the 18-day voyage from Buenos Aires to Genoa. But the last of this quartet, Exchange Bodol, is especially poignant. The wistfulness has returned. He had exchanged his basket of the wettest rains with her garland of the newest spring. Yet she had claimed victory. And now, at the end of the warmest day, the flowers had withered. It's been turned into a beautiful song. Tar hate chilo hashiro phulero har koto ronge rong kora. The richest gift carried within it the inevitability of loss. The flower garden at San Isidro was indeed where Rabindranath had spent his last spring. The memory of its sights and scents would animate the final years of his life. In the autumn of 1925, the poetry book Purobi was published. On 29th October 1925, Rabindranath wrote to Vijaya, "I'm sending you a Bengali book of poems, which I wish I could place in your hand personally. I have dedicated it to you, though you will never be able to know what it contains. A large number of poems in this book were written while I was in San Isidro. My readers who will understand these poems will never know who my Vijaya is, with whom they are associated. I hope this book will have the chance of a longer time with you than its author had. Bhalobasha." During his stay at San Isidro, wrote Victoria Ocampo on the occasion of the poet's birth centenary in 1961, Tagore taught me a few words of Bengali. I have retained only one, which I shall always repeat to India, Bhalobasha. In 1928, Rabindranath completed his complex social psychological novel, Jogajog, wrote the poetic novel, Shesher Kobita, that would startle the most modernist of the moderns in contemporary Bengali literature, composed the bulk of the poems of Mohua, and began his plunge into an ecstatic frenzy of painting faces and figures. The 2 novels and the book of poetry, which were published in 1929, were closely related. What the prose of the Diary of a Westward Voyage had been to the poetry of Purobi, Shesher Kobita was to Mohua, with the difference that the novel itself contained some of the most dazzling poetic innovations. Rabindranath wrote in the introduction to Mohua that the reader would find something new in this writing, in form and in kind. If Purobi resonated with the strains of a feminine evening melody of the East, Mohua took its name and inspiration from an intoxicating wild flower. The authorized chronicler of Rabindranath's life, Prabhat Kumar Mukhopadhyay, tells us that the love poems of Mohua deeply embarrassed the Gurudev's staid devotees and invokes a Sanskrit sloka composed by Bhavabhuti to make a point about the nobility of the poet's emotion. After the explosion of Mohua, Rabindranath's poetry went through a discursive shift from what has been called the love theme and put it under the control of a more general life theme. The vibrant creativity of Rabindranath's poetry in the last decade of his life saw the publication of the books Purishesh, 1932, Bichitra, 1933, Shesh Shoptok, 1935, Bithika, 1935, Potroput, 1936, Shanai, 1940, and Sheshlekha, 1941. The most famous poem in Purishesh, titled Query, Proshno, shows how far Rabindranath had travelled from the devotionalism of his Gitanjali days. The searing indignation of the last verse of this poem has carved out for it an immortal place in modern literature. Stifled is my voice today, my flute has lost its song, and my world swallowed up in a nightmare by the dark night's prison. My God, oh my God, I ask you in tears, those that are poisoning your air, those that are putting out your light, have you given them your love? Have you forgiven them all? Jahara tomar bishaiche bayu, nibhaiche tobo alo, tumi ki tader khoma koriacho, tumi ki beshecho bhalo. Throughout the 1930s, Tagore and Gandhi, despite their profound mutual respect and admiration, had engaged in vigorous debates. Tagore consistently took a stand on the side of science, development, and modernity. He was dismayed by the unreason inherent in Gandhi's characterization of the 1934 Bihar earthquake as divine chastisement for the sin of untouchability. In the late 1930s, he took keen interest in the plans being made by Subhash Chandra Bose, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Meghnad Shaha for the social and economic reconstruction of free India on modern lines. His address, composed in 1939, granting Subhash Chandra Bose the appellation Deshanayak, revealed where he stood in relation to the anti-colonial politics of that era. As Bengal's poet, Tagore wrote with his usual literary flair, I invite you to the honored seat of the leader of the people. We have the sacred assurance of the Gita that from time to time, the divine champion of the good arises to challenge the reign of the evil. When misfortune from all directions swarms to attack the living spirit of the nation, its anguished cry calls forth from its own being the liberator to its rescue. Tagore confessed that he had felt misgivings in the uncertain twilight of the dawn of Subhash Chandra's political sadhana. But now that he was revealed in the pure light of midday sun, there was no room for any doubt. Tagore was not setting up the warrior in counterpoise to the saint. Let nobody make such a grievous mistake as to think, he clarified, that in foolish pride of narrow provincialism, I desire to see Bengal as an entity separate from the rest of India, or dream of setting in my own province a rival throne to the one on which is seated a majestic figure representing a new age in the political history of the world. Yet, he saw Subhash Chandra as the deliverer, who would claim of his countrymen the resoluteness, the unyielding will to live and to conquer, strengthened by the inspiration of his own life. I may not join him in the fight that is to come, the 78-year-old poet wrote in conclusion. I can only bless him and take my leave, knowing that he has made his country's burden of sorrow his own, and that his final reward is fast coming as his country's freedom. 4 months before his death, in 1941, the chair from Argentina inspired a final reflection. One more time, if I may, I would like to find that seat in the lap of which is spread a caress from a foreign land. It will keep forever unsleeping that message, so sad, so tender, of that woman whose language I did not know, but whose eyes were eloquent. Rabindranath had not only understood the lyrical meaning of furniture imagery, but had raised it to a new level of sublimity. Thank you very much.
Wow, such a wonderful lecture. So please take this away so that we can. Now we are inviting Professor Amartya Sen for the comments and whatever he wishes to include. Professor Sen, please.
Am I interconnecting with you? Can you see me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but I cannot see you just yet. No. Or maybe, yeah.
Put in the speaker mode. Yeah, he was speaking.
You speak, Amartya.
Okay, good. What about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Yeah, we can hear you.
But you can't see me. That's the kind of magic.
We can see you. Yes.
We can see you now. Yes, wonderful. Yeah.
Okay, well, that was a terrific talk, and I feel very privileged to be here at this time, and not so much to speak, but mainly to hear the beautiful and illuminatingly revealing analysis that Sugata has presented. I will learn things from what he said, as I have always done, but I will not engage with particular issues that he discussed there. There's lots of new thoughts to discuss, but I will, related to the major theme, make a few points about Tagore's concerns and their relevance to South Asia in general and India in today's world. Tagore's life had various decades of emphasis of one kind or another, and Sugata brought that out quite remarkably clearly. What is striking to think that there was a little over a decade, beginning from around 1910 or so, when his work suddenly became very widely appreciated in Europe, led often by the championing of W.B. Yeats and Ezra Pound and others who were really very involved with what Tagore was like to say. This is the decade in which the First World War occurred, and just precedes the period on which Sugata concentrated in his lecture. The First World War was bloody and in many ways pointless. The Second World War was bloody too, including the nuclear bombs used at the end and the horrors of concentration camps and right-wing Nazi overtaking of periodic overtaking of almost the control of the world. The Second World War had a more of a rationale, and Tagore ended his life at the time when it was just opening up. His last one of his last writings, the so-called conquered, the crisis of civilization. He discussed that. But the Second World War had an ideological background to it, so they resistant to Nazism. There is the opening up of the issue of imperialism. All these came, and indeed, imperialism in the form known earlier came to an end by the shortly after the Second World War. Not that imperialism and inequality of power does not continue today. They do. But this was the basic idea. Many of them were being born during the Second World War, including resistance to imperialism, arbitrariness of the European dominance. And on the positive side, the sharing culture of food rationing and health care for all movements made things very different. Unfortunately, Tagore saw some of the early destructive aspects of the Second World War, which come into his last writing since he died in 1941, and some of the benefits that came from shaking up the world of ideas, which he was longing for, didn't really come. There's a connection that I think he would have particularly enjoyed, namely his focus on education, which was a very big thing and a continuing concern of Tagore through the different periods in his life. And already he had the opportunity when visiting Russia to be able to divide his praise of the priority of education that the newly founded Soviet Union gave. And at the same time, he gave an interview to Izvestia, which the Izvestia didn't publish. It came out in the Manchester Guardian, because he found the censorship and basically the dictatorial aspect of the Soviet Union to be repugnant. But in his letter, his book called Russia Titi, Letters to Russia, we often forget that the English version of it was never allowed to be published in British India. And it's only after independence that the book came out in that form. So if it plays Tagore in that perspective, the glory years were the first of those decades. This is the period in which you get the recognition, the Nobel Prize among them. But most importantly, he was almost a cult figure, and his meetings just produced hundreds of thousands of people who wanted to attend. By the time we come to 24, a crisis in the shape of reaction against the eulogizing of Tagore was beginning to grow. The China period, he got caught in the middle of that reassessing of Tagore. Now, this takes me a bit to the politics of Tagore, which is very, very relevant to today's Asia, today's world, and particularly to India and South Asia. Tremendous focus on enlightenment, on education, that continued, and he was pushing for it at that time as well. The enormous welcome that the Chinese leaders, political leaders, including the founders of the Communist Party, that gave to Tagore, that came Tagore's way, were particularly focused on these things that he shared with the new socialist movement emerging in Russia, China, Britain will go at their first naval victory much later. On the other hand, things were moving rapidly at that time. And so there is that issue. There is the issue that Tagore thought, and this is Sugata referred to it among his differences with Gandhiji, and I think Sugata quoted Gandhi telling the world that the Bihar earthquake had been the punishment of God for the practice of untouchability. This upset Tagore very much. He was a believer in science, believer in knowledge. These are very important to know today, since often science is being sacrificed in some of these countries in the name of piety to the past. And Tagore found a role for the past wisdom of India. Indeed, he dreamt of that. But he was also at the same time like a tiger, resistant to hidebound interpretation of local culture, Indian Hindu culture, which he could not take off on that those aspects not quite acceptable. We see that in the second period with which Sugata's talk was concerned, 24 onward, his Hibbert lecture in Oxford called The Religion of Man argues how religion is very important, but it has to take note of science and it cannot be anti-science. This lesson is so dramatically important in some of the countries, and in fact all the countries of South Asia today, that this is very, very crucial thing for us to know. And that is in Sugata's the period that he chose. But the other thing that was happening from the exaggeration of Tagore's being uniquely good in the world of poetry, is moved to a kind of resentment. I'm proud that my grandfather, who had come into Sugata's presentation, in fact, the first person he mentioned as his companion, Lamont Sen, was my grandfather. Tagore wrote the morning after the enormous reception, enormous not in size, but the power of the intellectuals of London being all there. Tagore wrote to Lamont Sen that how disturbed he was because there was a misinterpretation of what he was trying to say. He focused on one or two things, but most importantly, looking back at his work, is that on one side, Tagore was emphasizing Western science, Newton, onwards, Bacon, and all the big scientific things. And he had conversation with Einstein and discussed the way to understand truth and objectivity. He was there on the same footing as Einstein in looking for the best understanding of the world. And on the other hand, and much of it has come from the West, just as in an early period in with the evolution of printing in China, Japan, Korea, with the evolution of mathematics in the Arab world and in India. There's other things that had moved from the East to the West, but this was the time to learn something from the West. But he also thought that the message of peace, and particularly exemplified by the horrors of the First World War, need protestation. And some of the enormous following that Tagore got was a belief that this would be a good way of Europe avoiding crisis of this kind. In China, I think Tagore made a mistake. That is what China wanted to hear was more of the first. China had a hidebound culture as India, probably not as strongly as India. On the other hand, and at that time, even the Communist Party was on the same side, wanting reform. There was no difference between Tagore wanting that part of the East learning from the West. But there was a thing about the West learning from the East, which Tagore had come to see as the root of his foreign appreciation. That's what the world wants to hear from India and from Asia. And that, I think, was a mistaken diagnosis. And the cooling down of the Chinese enthusiasm for Tagore, the same people who had translated Tagore into Chinese, getting quite critical of Tagore, came from the fact that the message that was appropriate for Europe, and I think they were appropriate, including the greatness of Gitanjali. But China wanted to hear something, as did India. And while Tagore, in principle, was against hidebound perception of the glory of India and disagreed with Gandhiji, even Gandhiji on that. But the pursuit that what he thought was right for India to be respectful of Western science, to be respectful of Western ideas. And there were people who aiding that linkage. Sugata referred to Romarola, I think, and that was he was one of the figures in that. And in some ways, Yeats himself remained in that picture. On the other hand, the message that Europe needed with its experience of the First World War, learned from Asia, is not what the Chinese wanted to hear. They wanted to learn more about how to become a global player. If you require China to focus on science, mathematics, and so on. And it's an audience in China, which wasn't the appropriate fit for his lecture. Now, his work with Japan came for other reasons, and here the imperialism of Japan played a part, though Tagore had earlier enormously admired Japan's rising as a power and doing so much for reviving an Asian perspective in the world. That had problems which Tagore considered, and he was particularly upset about the rape of Nanking by the Japanese. And so there was a tension there. But in the case of China, we get a picture of something where Tagore had to say something. And I believe those who invited him also want him to say it. But instead, he was getting talks which were right for Germany and Britain, and but not quite right for the Chinese audience. Now let's stop here. I'm just commenting on Sugar's on a wonderful talk, but he encouraged me to think about the different.
Put on something of your stuff on the thing. This is where I can hear it over here.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Give.
Is that an indication that my time is up?
No, please continue.
No, but my time is really up, so I will stop. We should take from Tagore the enormous contribution that he made to understanding even of India, not to mention the world. And Bangladesh itself is a good example. Yeah, but I have to stop there, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and thank Sugata for a wonderfully enlightening talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sen. And now we will enter into question and answer session. Before that, we usually announce for the coming Saturday, but maybe directly, Rafat, you can take over and okay. You already have that. Well, totally distinct theme and talk. We are going to have this Dr. Afsar Muhammad from University of Pennsylvania on revisiting Muslim past, the case of Hyderabad, Deccan. That will be coming Saturday. So just take it out and let's do the question answer session. Dr. Rafan will be moderating this part. And so please follow his instruction, what he says.
Thank you, Dr. Raziuddin, and thank you so much for Professor Bose, Dr. Ankit Dey, and Professor Sen. What a wonderful treat to hearing all of them. So the question and answer session is open now. Although I gave two options mostly. One is to raise the digital hand and put your question in the chat box. But I would prefer today, because the audience is large, so I would prefer that you raise the digital hand so I can easily monitor that. Thank you so much, and let's begin with Imtiaz. Imtiaz Saab, please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yes, I could unmute. Earlier, I was having difficulty unmuting myself, but I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Good. Thank you, Professor Bose, for a very informative and enlightening presentation. Your use of your command on English language and your use in poetic prose is most impressive. I highly enjoyed it. I have two questions. Number one, poet Iqbal was a contemporary of Tagore. Was there any interaction between the two? And the second question is, India was going through a lot of turmoil and Hindu-Muslim division and tensions. What was Tagore's position on that issue?
Yes, thank you very much for those questions. I think that, Tagore and Iqbal shared quite a lot in common. Among them was a skepticism of, worshipping the European territorial model of the nation state. They were both patriots. They loved their homeland, but they were somewhat skeptical of the nation state form, and wanted Indian anti-colonialists not to imitate some of the worst features of European nationalism, which, for example, had led to the carnage of the First World War. But unfortunately, I don't think they had as much interaction as we might have wanted them to. However, we do know that, Iqbal passed away before Tagore. When Iqbal died in 1938, Tagore did issue a very, moving obituary reference to the great poet of Urdu and Persian literature. As for, as you say, the Hindu, Muslim, problems, Tagore was someone who believed in equality and unity. And for example, he was a great champion of the Swadeshi movement. He wrote beautiful patriotic poems and songs in 1905 and its aftermath. But when he saw that the Muslim peasantry and the small Muslim traders were facing coercion from the Swadeshi leaders, he became disenchanted. And some of that disenchantment was expressed in his novel Ghore Baire, Home and the World. And even later, I think he was extremely concerned about conflicts between Hindus and Muslims. And today, of course, I focused on 1924 and therefore his journeys to China and Japan and to Argentina. But elsewhere, I have written about his visit to Iran and Iraq in 1932. And in Iran, he visited the graves of the great Persian poets, Sadi and Hafiz. And in Iraq, he said something very interesting. This was 1932, and he was troubled by religious strife back in India. And he urged the Muslims of West Asia to send their message of universalism that had been so beautifully articulated by the Prophet of Islam, so that India could rise above, transcend the religious divisions that were, plaguing the country. So he was very, very consistent in taking a stand on unity based on equality of the various religious communities, the different linguistic groups, and of course, the different genders. And in this aspect, whatever his other differences, I think there was a certain commonality between Tagore and Gandhi, and also, of course, Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose, whom I mentioned as well in the course of this talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bose. The next person is Dr. Rabindranath Sen, please. I ask you to unmute.
Good evening, Professor Bose, and good evening to the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen Sahib. I have two questions. First, when did Rabindranath Tagore gave the title of Mahatma to M.K. Gandhi? And the second one is that the right wing often calls that Gitanjali won the Nobel Prize because of the flattery that Rabindranath Tagore offered to the George V, and that is why he wrote the national anthem that he wrote. How true is that diatribe of the right wing, if I may call so? These are my two questions.
Okay, I think that Rabindranath, referred to Gandhiji as the Mahatma in the early 1920s. He was the great soul, and Gandhi, in turn, tended to refer to Rabindranath Tagore as the great sentinel. So there was a great deal of mutual sort of respect and affection, despite their debates on questions of science and reason and so forth. And of course, the other point that you mentioned is a complete fabrication, and I think Rabindranath Tagore won the Nobel Prize in 1913 because his poems of Gitanjali appealed to what I described, a very sensitive section of the European literati, including W.B. Yeats and others. And so it was one based on his literary merit. But I should add that if you think of the song which has the first verse of which has become our national, anthem, it had absolutely nothing to do with the King Emperor, and Tagore completely rejected that charge in his lifetime. And I would just remind you of the second verse, which is not part of our national anthem, of that song, which is so very relevant today. Aharaha tabo avhana pracharita shuni tabo darabani হিন্দু বৌদ্ধ শিখ জৈন পারসিক মুসলমান খ্রিস্টানি পূরব পশ্চিম আসে তব সিংহাসন পাশে প্রেম হার হয় গাথা. So when he was talking about East and West, he was trying to bind all the religious communities of India with a garland of love.
Thank you, Professor Bose. We do have Professor David Lalieveld and Barbara Metcalf in our audience, and I would like to request them if they do have any comment or a question. So, sorry for taking the liberty to invite you. Professor Lalieveld, please. Is he still there, Rajiv?
Hello,
Hi.
can I make a comment?
Hold on for a second. I am inviting David Lalieveld first, please. Okay.
Professor Lalieveld, this is Razi. Can you come on for making some comments if you wish?
Okay, so he may not be there right now, but let's go to the next one. Dr. Metcalf, please.
I am Professor Ganguly from.
Hold on, please. I will invite you. Please raise your.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, maybe you can invite him first.
Okay, Razi bhai. So let's move on. Okay, Ganguly sir, please go ahead, Professor Ganguly.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this extremely perceptive, delightful lecture of Professor Bose. And I take this opportunity to not only thank him, but also my erstwhile teacher, Professor Amartya Sen, whom I get this opportunity to offer my pranam. I was in economics, then I shifted to Latin American studies. The only comment that I wanted to make in this presentation by Professor Bose is that perhaps during his stay in Argentina, Tagore did not show any interest in any Latin American author. In spite of the best efforts by Victoria Ocampo, he brought in 5 or 6 authors, the best ones, including Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, Guiraldes, etc., and also musicians, but Tagore did not show any interest. That's why we do not find any reference in Tagore to any Latin American author per se. Now, this was even, in the beginning, the conversation between them is described by what Victoria Ocampo once said, that there was more of the unsaid than the said. So there was very little conversation, but gradually it took over, it changed, and Victoria Ocampo started listening to some of the writings, translations of Tagore's poems. And in one poem particularly, I still remember, the poem is called Skeleton, Concal. He wrote it, and Victoria Ocampo took it to pare it down, and the next day, she found that Tagore had eliminated one stanza from the whole poem, which was a very important stanza describing the relation between creation, destruction, according to our philosophy. And she said, why did you? I'll just finish it. And he said, why? She said, why did you eliminate it? He said, you people, your culture will not understand it. And her comment was, you are most mistaken. You have absolutely no knowledge of what our culture understands. Now, these are some of the things that must be included in any a perception or lecture about Ocampo and Tagore's relationship. And Tagore never wanted to inform her about the great political upheavals that he was going through, he was writing, and he was not interested in that part, communicate that part of it to her at all. Now, these are some of the things. Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comment. Next person is Vaikuntha Swaminathan, please.
Thank you so much, sir, for getting us this opportunity to talk to Professor Bose, Professor Sen, and of course, Dr. Day. Sir, I just had this comment. Being a political science student, I had this just comment. I do think the NAM, non-alignment movement, was truly based on Tagore's line on Ekla Cholore. I would just like to invite Dr. Bose or Dr. Sen, whosoever want to that kind of kasana. Tell me if I'm wrong on it, but yeah, I do think Bose's Tagore's influences was this much on Nehru that NAM came into being. Thank you, sir. That's my question, or that's my comment.
Well, I don't think there was any direct influence, and in many ways, Tagore was in favor of intellectual conversations with all other regions of the world, even if Asia had a certain privilege in terms of his vision of geographical relations. So I don't think we should draw a direct line of connection. But of course, Tagore had close personal relationships with all of the important leaders of the Indian freedom struggle, including Tagore, including Nehru, and whose daughter came and studied in Shantiniketan for a while. But also going back to the earlier comment that was made, I think it's important to note that from colleagues in Spanish literature with whom I have talked, apparently, the translations of Tagore into Spanish by Jimenez and Camprubi were really of a very high order, which sometimes cannot be said of some of the earlier English translations. There are better ones that have been made now. And what we will try to do is to have a session at Harvard later this semester, where I'd like to get Diana Sorensen, who's one of our colleagues who's worked on Borges, to actually address this entire question of the relationship between Indian and Latin American literature.
Thank you so much, Professor Bose. Abdul Jabbar, sir, Dr. Abdul Jabbar.
So thank you. Fantastic, outstanding talk presentation. I have a question regarding Tagore's trip to Japan, staying there for I think one month, talking to intellectuals. Within 20 years after the time, Japan went in a different direction, appears to me, in terms of joining forces with the Hitler, other the warmongering kind of things. What is the transition? How the transition from Japanese intellectual thing and to this within 20 years time? How did it happen? What was that? That was I was kind of intrigued by that. So eliminate on that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes. I would, yes, Tagore actually visited Japan several times, actually altogether 5 times, but, including some stopovers. He had first visited Japan in 1916. He was, quite close to and influenced by Okakura Tenshin, whom he had met even in Boston when he came to visit Harvard and give his lectures, which were published under the title of Sadhana. This was in 1913. And then in 1916, he visited Japan. He was very impressed by Japanese art, But even in 1916, he, warned Japan not to, embark on a nationalistic imperialist, expedition. And then, of course, there was the visit in 1924. So, there were close ties with Japanese intellectuals and artists and so on, but also, warnings that were issued to Japan even then. Then his final visit to Japan was in 1929, as he was returning from the United States of America. And again, you see a little bit of an ambivalence, beautiful poem that he wrote, which was published in the Asahi Shimbun, praising Japan, but in his, talks and lectures, giving some sage advice to Japan on what to do and not to do. And you get some sense of the shift in his thinking when you see his relationship with the Japanese poet Yonajiro Noguchi, who had met Tagore and interacted with him in 1916, 1924, 1929. And then he visited India in 1935, and he met Mahatma Gandhi and Sarojini Naidu. But the highest point of his visit was a wonderful reception that Tagore gave him in November 1935 in the mango grove of Shantiniketan. But there was an exchange of letters that's worth reading in 1938 between the two poets, where Noguchi was simply saying that Japan was correcting the mistakes of Chiang Kai-shek, whom he saw as a puppet of the West, while Tagore saw the war as an attack on Chinese humanity. And I have actually discussed this relationship and also the correspondence in some detail in my book, Asia After Europe. And it is worth remembering that Subhash Chandra Bose, as president of the Indian National Congress, sent a medical mission to China in 1938, even though later he chose to take advantage of the international war crisis to take forward the struggle for India's freedom.
Thank you, Professor Bose. And the next question in the chat box is from Minu Gundevia, please. How would Tagore have reacted to Hindutva and Hindu nationalism of BJP? Bosa.
Amartya, would you like to take that?
Other than saying he would have been very much against the communalization of politics of India. And that's happened now with BJP, where there was an ancestral connection of which in the Hindu Mahatava, which wasn't not something that got a great admiration from Tagore in the way that he presented to the very secular figure of Subhash Chandra Bose, Netaji, at that time. So I think the answer is that he would have been opposed to any of this criminalization of politics. And I think the book I referred to, his lecture, Tibet lecture, The Religion of Man, goes into that question very extensively. And as Sugata mentioned, in Gore Baile, which Satyajit Ray made into a wonderful movie, Home in the World. And that shows how opposed he was to the tyranny of a majority, in this case, in the national movement. And if that happened politically over a country, one would have no difficulty in thinking that he would not have regarded that to a good move at all. And that's to put it rather mildly.
Thank you, Professor Sen. The next question is from Siloni Sengupta, please. Sengupta. He raised the digital hand, then I see him leaving. Sengupta, let me check. Yeah, he's not there. Okay, so Next is from Muhammad Firoz Ahmad. Okay, here is Sen Gupta sir. Please go ahead. Saloni Sen Gupta. I ask you to unmute. There are only few more questions. We don't hear you, Sen Gupta sir.
Hello, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, sir. It was a very nice lecture. I have just query about that. At that time, the contemporary Hindi, what was the impression that in contemporary Hindi at that time, that was known as the Chayavad or romanticism in Hindi. And Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore has a larger influence of his persona as well as his perceptions in the Hindi literature also. Then how Rabindranath Tagore or how Rabindranath Tagore was impressed by the some Hindi writers are at that time. Importantly, the Kabir and some other Hindu poets at the time. Whether it was the any impact of Nirala or some kind of the Hindi Jaishankar Prasad over the Kabir over Rabindranath Tagore.
You know, I mentioned in the course of my lecture that, he took with him Kithimohan Sen, Amartya Sen's grandfather, to China, and he mentioned even in his talks in China how he had been introduced to the bhakti literature in what was the old Hindavi and Braj and so on. And of course, he did translate and present some of the poems of Kabir. I think 100 poems of Kabir. So he was, in many ways, I'm not so sure about contemporary Hindi literature, but he certainly was deeply influenced and impressed by the early the bhakti poetry of Kabir and Dadu and so on.
Okay, Razi bhai, how much time we do have? One more question from Kajal.
It's up to Professor Bose.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Wish otherwise we can conclude it quickly, rapid.
Can we go 5 more minutes, Professor Bose and
Professor? Okay, yeah, 5 more minutes. I think we are already over time.
Yeah, I know
about
that.
12 minutes, but okay, 5 more minutes then.
Okay, so please be brief. Kajal Mukhopadhyay, please go ahead, and then last one will be the Firoz Ahmad.
Oh, absolutely. And this is such a wonderful an honor to have this Saturday morning spending with Professor Bose and Sen, but I'll be very brief. So Tagore's visit to 1912, after that he won the Nobel Prize and went to do the Vishwabharati. He visited Urbana-Champaign, and then I think he visited twice after that to the US and had the Sadhana lectures. So I was wondering, because we are doing a lot of the research on his first visit, because we were able to do where Tagore had stayed in 508 West High Street, and he wrote all the sadhanas and everything. So we're able to get that place. But your research is intriguing us because there is a political journey that started, and how the I would say, the Bengal divisions and everything in 1905 and 6, he came to the US, he won the Nobel Prize, but how that US and taking it east and west influences the work that he has done on the political spectrum, nationalisms and all those things after that in the Asian continent, which is also in his vision is East. I may be wrong, but I just wanted to ask you that very briefly.
Thank you, Mukhopadhyay.
Actually, again, Rabindranath Tagore visited the United States many times. You're right that he first came in 1912, and he arrived in New York, went to Urbana-Champaign, visited Chicago, and it was in early 1913, before he won the Nobel Prize, that he came to the East Coast, to New York and Boston, And he, delivered altogether 5 lectures in February 1913 and April 1913. And one of my students, Mo Banerjee, did some research in the Harvard archives, and it seems to me to be clear that Okakura, who was then at the Museum of Fine Arts, had played a role in getting, Tagore, invited to Harvard. And Binoy Kumar Sharkar tells us, based on his visit to Japan in 1915, that the Japanese bought thousands of copies of Sadhana. And in fact, that made a bigger splash than the Nobel-winning Gitanjali. Tagore was back in the United States in 1916, and he came from Japan. And that's when he gave his critical lectures on nationalism as he traveled from the West Coast to the East Coast. And in 1917, these lectures were put together in the little book Nationalism that was published in 1917. He came again in 1921, and in fact, his final visit was in 1930. I showed you a picture of Tagore with Victoria Ocampo in Paris at the Gallery Pigalle in 1930. But after that, he came to the United States, and there were exhibitions of his paintings in both New York and Boston. And I showed you a portrait of Tagore taken in Boston in 1930. Now, the broad question of Tagore's conceptions of East and West is possibly too large now to take on. But what I will say is that Tagore was in favor of conversations with all parts of the world, and he never wanted to shut down any kind of engagement with the West. And so, for example, Gandhi would say in early 1931, when he was asked by a journalist in England, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? And Gandhi responded, I think it would be a good idea. But Tagore had a more expansive view, and he would be, critical of Europe insofar as it had not, presented its best phase to colonized Asia, and therefore he was in favor of Asian solidarity. But that did not mean that he believed in any kind of a rigid defining line between civilizations of East and West. He wanted to
Thank you, Professor. Thank you both, Professor Bose. The last question from Sen Gupta ji, and then I hand over to Dr. Raji.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
I feel grateful to be able to attend a session that features icons whom I have grown up admiring and being in awe of. Modi, I call her Modi. Modi was my senior in university. So thank you. It was wonderful to hear you mention her, sir. My question is regarding Tagore's stance on Gandhi's idea of non-cooperation and how he viewed from an ethical standpoint the idea of boycott or burning of foreign-made goods.
Thank you.
Well, during the Swadeshi movement, when there was the first attempt at boycotting not just British goods, textiles, and so on, but also the
I believe you're on mute.
Rabindranath, even in 1905, wanted to place a greater emphasis on national education, something that was much more, positive. And in some ways, it was the National Education Council which, Swadeshi was not entirely inward-looking. There was an element of Swadeshi internationalism that we also must recognize. And there were students who got scholarships from this National Education Council, who went to study in Japan, in Germany, in the United States of America. And when Rabindranath visited Harvard, for example, he was surrounded by nearly half a dozen Indian students, mostly Bengali, who had come as scholarship holders to study even here at Harvard, including Narendranath Sengupta, who was the father of Indian psychology after he went back. With non-cooperation, because Tagore knew that the boycott of educational institutions had destroyed the career of one generation of students in India, he was not in favor of the boycott of educational institutions when Mahatma Gandhi called for non-cooperation in 1920-21. Now, as I mentioned, he was away in 1921 abroad, including here in the United States, and then he went back. It is very interesting that Rabindranath Tagore and Subhash Chandra Bose traveled on the same ship back from Europe to India in 1929, in July, when after Subhash Chandra Bose had resigned from the ICS, and they had conversations on the ship about non-cooperation, and Tagore then gave a lecture in the University Institute Hall on his return, and also wrote an article where he explained why he was not in favor of boycott of at least educational institutions, and he wanted much more of an exchange of education and cultures and so forth. So that was again one of the other differences that he had with Mahatma Gandhi, even though both were absolutely and deeply committed to the goal of Indian freedom.
Thank you very much. That concludes the question and answer session. Before I hand over to Dr. Raziuddin, I once again like to thank all three speakers and for their time, and of course the audience participation. Thank you very much. Back to Dr. Raziuddin.
I think it's almost, as you said, is over. I mean, more than 2 hours passed, so we shouldn't really extend any further. I also just thank you all very much. And there was just one comment from Professor Monajit Chatterjee reminding me probably that we should have a talk on Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose by you. So, though I remember that 2 years back you just gave one talk, but that was not on Netaji. It was something on the Indian nationalism, bringing Professor Anita Bose also along with Rajmohan Gandhi. So we will just all approach you again. Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Sen, for staying so long with us. It was really, truly enjoyable. We learned a lot, wonderful talk, and a lot of people have really had joined. YouTube will be available in a week time. Thank you all.